Hello, Dr. Bronner. So excited to meet you. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us at Urban Media today. We're excited to talk to you a little bit. I share a bit about your background. And so you're currently the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Clinical Trials for the Janssen Pharmaceutical Company. So that's connected to Johnson and Johnson.
It
And
is.
you
It's one of they're one of their companies.
okay, and you've also done postdoctoral work at UC Davis. You have your PhD from University of Michigan, I believe.
I do. I am a Midwest girl who got tired of snow and moved out to California. I
Understand
was like,
that.
I cannot. I can't do it. I cannot do it.
Yes, I totally understand that. We talked before about how we want to share with our readers and viewers about African American health, Black health, and how a lot of studies, a lot of things are showing there's a lot of disparity in our care and in diagnosis. And so we're looking for experts to talk to us about how we could be our own best advocate, which is a great thing for us to do. Although in some ways it seems a little unfair that we kind of have to,
You got to do the
really
work. It
exactly. I
should be
mean,
natural, right?
a little bit more than maybe other patients would have to do. It's great to be taking the lead in our own health. It's more so not because we're being proactive. There's a lack of information with our providers, and so these are things that we have to do on our own, which again was helpful, but it comes from a detriment in our services.
Oh my God, yes. I mean, like you said, being your own advocate, every patient should do that. Every
Mhm.
single patient. Because again, you're the only one who knows what you're doing and how you're feeling on the day to day. Some of us do not like to be truthful about what we're dealing with because no one wants to admit that you're getting older or that you have
Mhm.
health issues. But when you're thinking about, going and talking to a doctor, you need to be very open and honest about what is happening. Now, of
Mhm.
course, you'll see a lot of times in the media, they're like, oh, well, patients don't trust doctors. And
Mhm.
there have been some atrocities that have happened in the past, and patients can't get past it. And you say, those things have happened in the past, but let's not forget what is still ongoing. You
Mhm.
actually take a deep dive into the data of what's happening and you talk to patients, you can hear a lot of them say that they've been severely dismissed, they've
Mhm.
been misdiagnosed,
Mhm.
told that what you have, you can't have it because of your race.
Mhm.
And then insurance comes into play.
Mhm.
Always makes me think about the founder of Kochi, which is a color of colitis and chronic illnesses. So Kochi, and her story of how she, had been suffering with IBD
Mhm.
for decades,
Mhm.
and they always thought, oh, it's not IBD, it's this or that. Just take your over-the-counter medicines. And she suffered for
Mhm.
2 decades before she
Mhm.
was properly diagnosed with IBD.
Mhm.
And hearing that story and how severe the disease had progressed, there are many others, millions of other patients that are exactly like that. And when you think about Black patients in general, we've heard of many of the stories of where Black mothers have gone in and are talking about, I'm having some pains or I'm having some issues, and they keep
Mhm.
dismissing them. And I
Mhm.
know that there's this one documentary, and I have to think about what the name of it is, where they talk about the atrocities that are happening when it comes to maternal medicine with Black women and the families that have been destroyed by this. So these things are still ongoing, right? We've heard about Serena Williams, right? We've heard about how people have had to advocate for themselves. And
Mhm.
you say to yourself, we have medical professionals who have been trained to identify, diagnose, and treat diseases, and yet they're still in these old paradigms of Black people, have a higher pain tolerance, or
Mhm.
IBD doesn't affect them, or
Mhm.
whatever the case may be. And they're serving as a gatekeeper, preventing them from being able to explore not only treatments, but the idea of clinical research as well.
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
very, very interesting when you start to look at that.
Mhm.
And it's sad to know that in this day and age, with all of the availability of data, that we're still having patients that are having to advocate and bounce from doctor to doctor before they actually get true care.
You talked about a patient and her symptoms being dismissed because I guess with the research or what doctors are typically taught that it can't happen to someone like her, whatever
Yes.
her demographics are. But I wonder, what is the hesitance of doctors not to possibly think it could be this? Is it like insurance companies maybe not paying for testing, or is it just their own confirmation bias, or is there other things that might impact why they don't search beyond?
I mean, it could be a number of things, but I do
Mhm.
know that when you think about data that's out there, like when you think about inflammatory bowel disease or IBD,
Mhm.
and they're positioning it as it's higher or has a higher prevalence in white people.
Mhm.
That gets stuck in the head of many people. So when you have someone who's Black or Hispanic who comes in and is presenting, they'll say, well, have you taken anything that really alleviates it? And they'll say sometimes it does. And
Mhm,
that leads them down, like you said, this confirmation bias type of thing that, oh, okay, well, it can't be this. And a
mhm,
lot of times what requires more screenings and tests that need to be done. So for colonoscopies, those things can take a while to get scheduled. Insurance can play a role in that.
mhm,
Just certain lab tests as well. There's tons of studies have come out like with COVID, when we're talking about with COVID, you had such a higher prevalence within Black and Hispanic communities. But
mhm,
when patients were going in and complaining of having a shortness of breath, the oximeter was telling them, well, you're fine. You're at
mm,
98%, 99%. But because of skin tone differences, and it wasn't reading it properly, a lot of these
mhm,
patients were being dismissed because they're like, oh, you're just saying it because you want attention.
mm,
So when the system itself is set up in a way that does not highlight these differences, that is not accounting for these differences, doctors kind of get stuck in that rut. And you do have some doctors who do say, you know what, let me just double check, let me just cross all my T's, dot my I's. But again, they're seeing how many patients a day, right?
mhm,
And the fact that they probably have had some experience where patients have come in and have said, I just want to get something. I think with the data having a lag and catching up and actually demonstrating the epidemiology, the prevalence, the incidence, that and the other types of data to kind of show what is really the differences between races and how they're responding to treatment or how the disease progresses in them. One That's going to take some time for that to catch up, and the
mhm,
only way that you can really get that to catch up is through clinical research,
mhm.
or through just the individual research projects that are being funded, right, by the NIH, right, and other regulatory bodies that allow for us to be able to investigate genetic differences or other types of environmental differences that could occur within these different races or demographics.
Mhm. Let's talk a little bit about these clinical studies. So this may be a little broad, but maybe we can start at just how clinical studies or research, how does that ball get rolling?
Oh man. So clinical studies actually take a long time.
Mhm,
And COVID really raised the awareness of
mm,
clinical research.
mm,
And the amount of times that it was mentioned in social media through hashtags was ridiculous.
mhm,
And it really just took off. So you see a lot of patients who were at home, they're like, I don't have anything else to do. Let me read up on this.
mhm,
And I think the thing that really got people was that how fast these clinical trials had moved
mhm,
to get COVID, get these COVID vaccines into the market. But what they didn't see was that they had thousands of participants who were participating in these clinical research studies, and you didn't have all the barriers. So a lot of times when you're trying to set up a clinical trial, you have, you're trying to get all these different sites, you're trying to get patients involved, and people are kind of like, I don't know if I should or I shouldn't. And because the world had kind of shut down, it was
mhm,
easy to get these things through, especially with federal government saying, let's kind of get this thing through to, kind of fast track this.
mhm,
But the fact that you had such a large amount of people who were signing up for clinical research and for these trials
mhm,
speaks volumes, because typically you
mhm,
don't see that large number of people coming into a trial.
mhm,
And when you think about clinical research, there are multiple phases of what it has to go through.
mhm,
Prior to even getting to humans, they have to do tons of work, preclinical is what they call it. And this is where they're doing stuff in cells and also doing animal models.
mhm,
If you see any type of thing that doesn't work out, and in that session, in that part of clinical research, it doesn't progress. So
mhm,
like if you're testing this in mice and, you know, 50% of your mice die or more die, you're like, well, we can't move that on now, can we?
mhm,
And the reason why you go from, simple to more complex is because typically in cells or any type of lab culture, you're basically testing to see if the idea works. So if you say a certain pathway should be turned on or off, does that happen? And
mhm,
once you confirm that, you go into a more complex level with mice
mhm,
who share some genetic similarities to us and see, okay, in this model, which is a full functional organism, it's breathing, it has organs, it has an immune response, what happens? If that goes well, then you can start to transition to what they call first in human studies.
mhm,
And these studies, there's again different phases. There's four main phases. In phase one, this is when you really are trying to understand one, what is, the dose and safety.
mhm,
And you're trying to figure out what is the proper dosing that we need to do. And this is typically done in healthy volunteers.
mhm,
Reason being is because if a healthy volunteer can't take this and is having adverse events, or as we call side effects, you don't want to put this in someone who's struggling with a
mhm,
particular disease or condition.
mhm,
So if it passes that, it can move into the phase two, which is in larger number of patients that are participating. And that's when you start to get more into safety and a bit of efficacy. So
Mm,
safety along the lines of we know what dose we want to use. Now is it safe to use? And that's when you start to have that kind of a gray line, depending on if it's a phase 2A or phase 2B. Do
mhm,
you have healthy volunteers? And then do you start to transition into people who actually have the condition itself?
mhm,
And there are strict guidelines on who can participate, and you have inclusion criteria or exclusionary criteria that are really there to kind of help maintain the safety of the patients.
mhm,
Now, at any time a patient's participating in a clinical study, they can drop out. So
mhm,
even if you get in, you get screened, you get enrolled into the study, and you're like, you know what, life is getting in the way, or
mm,
I don't like the way the site is interacting with me, or I'm having issues that are really impacting my quality of life. They're monitoring you, but you
mhm,
have the option to drop out. It is your right as a patient. But if it's able to make it past that point of phase 2, phase 3 is when you start to have a larger number of people who are in it. So this is when you start to really try to expand the
mhm,
number of people who are taking this to really demonstrate efficacy or the effectiveness of the drug.
mhm,
And once you get to that stage, right, that is where you're starting to really demonstrate as an organization, hey, this drug works. Look how effective it was. We didn't
mhm,
have any adverse events, or we had very little, nothing that was too severe. And phase 4 is really where it's like more pulse marketing. So once it's been approved and goes onto the market, there's
mhm,
still going to be trials that are ongoing to say more
mhm,
longitudinal or long term what are happening with patients as they're on these types of drugs. And those
mhm,
are again thousands of patients. So it keeps increasing as you go on.
mhm,
And when you're looking at these different studies, it's very important to understand that at all stages, what does the representation of these patients look like?
mhm,
And there have been several reports that have come out, and the FDA has made it very clear that we need to change because representation has been terrible. If you
mm,
look at the vast majority of clinical trials that have been conducted, typically speaking, they are on 80 to 85% white.
mm,
That other 15 to 20%, if that, if you're lucky, it's not just Asians, it's
mhm,
Asians, Hispanic, Black, Middle Eastern, right? Everybody under the sun, all lumped together,
mhm,
but you're still skewed in
mm,
one population versus the other. And
yeah,
this is not just in the late stage. This is even all the way back to the healthy volunteers who
mm,
they use as a baseline.
mhm,
So if your baseline is based in whiteness and you start to try and increase representation at later stages, and you're like, well, why wasn't this coming up?
mhm,
Well, let's take a look back at the earliest stages. Were they there? And I always like to bring up the example of blood pressure medication.
mhm,
So for the longest time, standard of care was really just using like beta blockers, ACE inhibitors.
mhm,
And that seems to work because according to the clinical trials and what we were seeing in the market, it seemed to be effective.
mhm,
But doctors were starting to see that in Black patients, this wasn't an effective tool.
mm,
And that in some Black patients, you had to use something else, like a calcium channel blocker
mhm,
or a diuretic.
mhm,
And those were more effective in maintaining and managing their blood pressure. But
mm,
when did they find that out? After the fact. So when
mhm,
you think about the fact that you're trying out these new therapies that are coming onto the market and diseases that have a higher prevalence in certain groups. So if you think about type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, right? If you think about prostate cancer,
mhm,
lupus, these
mhm,
are diseases that typically have a higher prevalence in non-whites.
mhm,
And yet, when you look at the studies, they are typically what? Mostly white.
mm,
So it doesn't match.
yeah,
And when you think about the general population within the US, just in general, not even taking into the account of the world, but in general in the US,
mhm,
Blacks make up 13% of the population.
mhm,
And yet they only represent about 2 to 3% in clinical trials.
mm,
But when you look at other systems like the prison system,
mhm,
we're overrepresented, right? So it's like something's not right here. We're getting major disconnects.
yeah,
So this is why when you advocate for yourself, you come across these things like such as implicit bias, which a lot of people don't like to talk about, but is
mm,
some of the reasons why, in addition to the mistrust of the medical community,
mhm,
that
mhm,
we're seeing why we do have such a low representation of Black people in clinical trials.
mm. Wow. I'm not a medical professional, so I may be using this out of context, but I think of doctors taking a vow not to do any harm. And I'm also thinking of the responsibility of whether it's the FDA or the NIH, or also in the private sector as well, sponsoring these clinical trials in the case of diseases where there are many more adverse effects and deaths in people of color. Who is making sure that we are recruited and in these trials? That's not to the detriment of white people, but obviously there's a special population that needs emergency care. And so why is that not something that's encouraged or required?
Oh, and this is a great question. So when you think about who is responsible, I say there's multiple parties that are responsible.
Mhm,
One, people like to say patients, which is true. You
mhm,
are responsible for your own healthcare
mhm,
journey, for your health. Your health is wealth. The other people outside of that who are in charge of setting up the systems and putting these things in place,
mhm,
that's where you start to look at the healthcare professionals,
mhm,
because as highly educated as they are, there are many of opportunities for them at conferences where they talk about these things. And you're starting to see more and more talks covering genetic differences,
mhm,
environmental differences, differences across demographics, and not just looking at it with race and ethnicity, looking at this across with sex assigned at birth, thinking about LGBT
mhm,
community.
mhm,
There's many different groups that are not being represented in clinical research.
mhm,
And a lot of times you have individuals who self-identify in each of these different categories.
mhm,
So when they're looking at these results and they're going, well, have you tested it in this type of person or this? And they ask their doctor, well, how do I know that this works for me?
mhm,
Doctor can say, honestly, I don't know.
mhm,
And because the research is not there.
mhm,
However, because of your other profile of what you're exhibiting for your disease, this is what I think would be the best fit. But again, there should also be some type of ownership from industry,
mhm,
right? Where they are partnering with physicians and educating them and training them and partnering with the right ones who do care about all patients, who do, treat these types of patients, right? Who understands the importance of diversity and isn't going, I really don't want to mess up my numbers. I'm doing really good with recruitment. And you can hear
mhm,
that sometimes. So when
mhm,
you look at these different sections and also thinking about how the insurance companies are sometimes the biggest hurdle,
mhm,
and just what the government is trying to do now, what they passed the Omnibus-FDORA bill, where it
mhm,
was talking about we need to have representation within our clinical trials. That's at a
mhm,
federal level that they're mandating this.
mhm,
So now that the federal government has stepped in, now everybody's like, oh my God, we got to scramble to get this going. So I
mhm,
think we'll start to see that change happening, and it's
mhm,
going to take some time, but that's when new data will start to flood, the
mhm,
environment. And we're starting to say, okay, if we actually start to listen to these type of patients at all levels and pull that through, then I think we'll start to see that change for representation.
mhm,
But we also have to be mindful that people will be a bit hesitant. They will
mhm.
not trust. But you cannot gloss over the history that's
Exactly.
there.
Mhm,
You cannot gloss over of what's currently happening with
mhm,
patients, where some of them have been dismissed,
mhm,
misdiagnosed, and the fact that we can't gloss over what their journey is like. You've had some patients, like if you think about dermatology and you think about a disease like psoriasis, a
mhm,
lot of people know what psoriasis looks like, but when you actually look up psoriasis in Google or
mhm.
in medical textbooks, it's all on white skin.
Yes.
We know that Black people and Hispanic people can be affected by that, and different skin tones can make the disease present differently. So, you
Mhm,
typically on fairer skin, it's more red,
mhm,
right? When it's inflamed. But on darker skin tones, it's not the case. It may actually come up like a more of a purple, right?
mhm,
Or a
mhm,
darker shade.
mhm,
And you might think, oh, that's nothing. It's just, something else when it actually is psoriasis.
mhm,
So how the disease presents itself can vary. When you look at medical textbooks, I think they said less than 20% of it medical images include skin of color when it comes to
mhm,
dermatology, to
mhm,
dermatological types of diseases.
mhm,
And there was a study that came out where they asked dermatologists, well, how many of you actually feel that you receive adequate training when it comes to skin of color? And 47% of them said, I do not feel that I've received adequate training. And these
mhm,
are individuals who have made it through med school, done a
mhm,
residency, and are treating patients. And they're saying at that stage, which is years post grad, post
mhm,
undergrad, they do not feel adequately trained.
mhm,
You have to say to yourself, the system is not set up properly. But there are things that are trying to change it. So one company like Visual DX is trying to change it by building up a repository of images of showing what does skin of color look like for all of these different diseases within dermatology. Like atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, and things along those lines. And then there's other companies that are out there, such as Athlonate, who work very hard in raising community awareness about clinical research and helping patients find the resources that they need. Kochi is doing this with raising awareness about IBD within the Black communities, Black and Hispanic communities on a global level now. They started off in the US and now they're going global. And they're really targeting the younger generation at a college level to say, hey, you guys need to learn this and then share it out, disseminate this information out. So there are different organizations, patient groups, biotech startups that are really starting to try to change the game. And you'll see a lot of sponsors like my company and others like GSK, Novartis, Sanofi, the big pharmaceutical companies who are now putting in a lot of money, millions of dollars, into different initiatives to help educate physicians, to educate patients, and to make sure that clinical trials are more representative. But we're starting to see that now.
Better late than never, but I'm glad that's happening. Now, you had just mentioned the bill on your wonderful Instagram page, The Pulse.
The
Yeah,
Pulse.
The Pulse. So I will link to that in our video. But also you had listed some information about the Depict bill.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
and that's actually a part of that larger Omnibus-FDORA bill.
Okay.
And it's really focusing on the fact of having proper representation. And this is where they're talking about in clinical trials starting at phase 3, which is that later stage where you have a larger number of patients, that making sure that you have proper representation, that diversity plans are being instilled. And diversity plans are really just a way to kind of cover the tactics that you're using for that. How are you engaging with the community? Have you identified the right patient group? And then how did you set your goals, if any, for these clinical studies? And just getting into the fact that we really need to start thinking about, how are we funding this? Who are we partnering with? How are we getting this out there? Because again, everybody has seen for quite some time that these trials have not been truly representative of the population or the disease state itself. And now people have been pushing for this. And the biggest thing that makes it a little bit challenging outside the US is that when you think about race and ethnicity, a lot of people say it's very US centric. When you go into other parts of the world, especially like in Europe, we have found within industry that they don't collect that data as frequently as we do. And for them, race is not really discussed in the same way. Diversity is not seen on a race and ethnicity level. It's more of nationality. Well, where did you come from? What country did you migrate from?
Okay.
And so when you're trying to collect this data on a global scale, you'll see that there's incomplete data sets. So when you're trying to think about this on a global scale for representation, it can be quite difficult. And there are nuances. When you think about Black, there's nuances there because you have, Afro-Caribbean, you have Black Americans in the US, you have Africans from Africa, right? And whoever else and wherever else in the world they have migrated to. So, and even within the Latin community or Hispanic, you're lumping them all together again, but there can be nuances across Latin America versus Hispanics in Europe. Hispanics in the US. So we're starting to see that being more inclusive, and we talk about this in trials, is not just getting more bodies in, but allowing them to actually feel identified. When we're saying, check the box for what you are. You're not doing that, they're going to be like, well, I guess I'll choose this. And when you think about people who are multiracial, right? You could be Black and Asian, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you analyze that person, right? So it's like these type of things are starting to come up more and more. And I think people are, and then there's been a call by the federal government to expand the race and ethnicity categories on consensus form. So if they're talking about changing that, there's going to be changes in industry and in other places where you get to check off what your race or ethnicity is. But we also have to keep in mind that when we think about data in general, just as I was talking about earlier, if they're going through the ER or urgent care, or they're being misdiagnosed or misdiagnosed for something else when they really should be diagnosed for the actual disease, that you're missing them. So the data will say, well, they're not there. I don't understand why you're saying Black people or Asian people or Hispanic people have this disease. Well, it's like in actuality, you're not looking at the bigger picture, or some of the data is missing because they're falling through the cracks. Things like that make this quite difficult, but these bills that have been put in place are starting to push industry to start to change how we're collecting that data, when are we collecting that data and making sure that we have the proper representation in
Mm,
these clinical trials?
that's great.